Welcome. Good evening, everybody. I'm Hamad Nasser. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. And with Sarah Turner, who's the Deputy Director for Research, I'm sort of the co-convener for this lecture series on entangled histories between Britain and South Asia. When we started 5 weeks ago, Sarah announced this as very much of a beginning of term to this lecture series. And now as we finish in our 5th week, at least for a little while, it feels like end of school, but perhaps it will in another hour and a half. But I'm really thrilled that there are many sort of familiar faces here. And after 4 weeks of looking at the sites of the exhibition, but museums, the East India Company, art schools, both here and in South Asia, we arrive at the site of art itself for these entangled histories. And I'm thrilled that we have 3 artists who we will be in discussion with for this evening. The format is going to be something slightly different from what we've had before. There will be 3 short presentations, so roughly around 20 minutes each by each of the artists. And then we will run for a little bit longer. We will stop at 8:30. So then we will all sort of gather here for a little discussion amongst the artists, but hopefully also you. Certainly on what you see today, but also if you want to sort of engage in a discussion, in a wider discussion of what you've been seeing over the last 5 weeks. So before I introduce the artists, I also wanted to just acknowledge and thank a crucial member of the team, Nerman Abdullah, who despite being on holiday is probably watching us on live stream right now and has made sure that things run on time. So thank you, Nerman. Enjoy your holiday. And now we'll start. I'm going to introduce the artists in the order in which they will speak. First is Sophie Ernst, who trained as a mechanic at BMW before going on to study sculpture at the Academy in Maastricht. She's also a graduate of the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, and last year completed a PhD from Leiden University. In her artistic work, she inquires into the notion of projection in relation to architecture, memory, culture, historical objects, urban spaces, and identity. Her recent solo exhibitions include Memory is an Ideal Place at the Kunstverein in Heidelberg, Home at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and other notable exhibitions include the 6th Moscow Biennale, the Sharjah Biennale, Move on Asia at ZKM in Karlsruhe, and she was sort of a crucial member of the Lines of Control project that started in 2005 and had its last iterations at the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University and the Nasher Museum in Duke. So with that, I'd like to welcome Sophie to the rostrum.
Just get everything ordered here. Can everyone hear me when I speak like this? Yeah? Well, thank you, Hamad, for the introduction. And also a big thank you to Sarah and Hamad for including me in this lecture series. You have, over the last month, studied various moments in the relations of London and South Asia, and I feel quite privileged to add my perspective to the discourse of entanglement which you have been developing here. So I'm also looking forward to that discussion we will have later. Now we may deconstruct and reconstruct cultural entanglements and colonial legacies, but inclusion of the disregarded stories in the dominant narrative is actually not enough. Like Zara Jumaboy so lucidly demonstrated during a conference here last year, It is not about being invited to the party. That's what she said. As I see it, we must challenge the narrative altogether. We need to ask again and again, what is progress, what is memory, but also what is art. So as you've already heard from Hamad in the introduction, I'm an artist. I'm a sculptor by training. And my practice is based on walking. I walk. I stroll, I wander, I observe, I collect impressions, which I use in my art making. In German, it's called spazieren. Now, spazieren originates from the Latin spatior, which means next to walking, also to expand. So let me expand. I hope not beyond the 20 minutes I have. I've spent a good portion of the last decade and a half walking the cities of former European empires like Karachi and Lahore, Delhi, Bombay, Jakarta, but also Hamburg, Rotterdam, Brussels, and of course London. Now, one of my first rambles through London was as a student, and if I think back now, that London looked a bit like this. It appeared like a place of happiness, equality, and it came with a sense of heightened self-awareness. It was much later that I came to realize that the relation of Europe with Asia has left us two enduring legacies, that of heartbreak and unawareness. Now, these legacies are in sharp contrast to the promise of liberalism and enlightenment which the European empires had made to the world, which was that of perpetual happiness, equality, and a sense of heightened self-awareness. Europe hesitates to address its difficult pasts. Now, perhaps looking at their complex and messy pasts is politically dangerous. European states do not know where it might lead them or what it might cost. Now, please allow me to take you on a short walk and let me expand on three observations regarding unawareness and heartbreak. I'll introduce you to a couple of places and people that I met. First, meet Zarina Hashmi. She's an Indian artist living in New York. Some of you may know her work. When we spoke about her memories of the partition of the Indian subcontinent, she spoke about loyalty.
I'm very fortunate, nobody in my family died, nobody lost too much property, but these are hidden hurts which stay with you. Because when you go back and if someone says, at one time it was very common, and if you're wearing a shalwar kameez, which is a Punjabi dress, it's not a Muslim dress, it's not a Pakistani dress, oh, you look like a Pakistani, or are you a Pakistani? And it really doesn't matter, but I think I'm very sensitive to it because I feel almost every Muslim in India is identified as a Pakistan sympathizer.
So, to that person in shalwar kameez symbolized Pakistan, and seeing her wear shalwar kameez was enough to question her loyalty to India. This is the Israeli author Sami Michael. Sami was born in Baghdad, and when Palestinian architect and Sinan Abdel Kader and Sami met, they spoke about living between two worlds, and they discussed new tools they each had to develop in their respective crafts.
الكتاب فيها ثلاث شوارع الشارع الشرقي العراقي، شارع العلاقات بين اليهود والعرب، والشارع التصادم او التعايش وعدم التعايش بين اليهود الشرقيين والغربيين داخل اسرائيل. هذه 3 مواضيع اللي يمكن اللي بتهمني يعني، وانا اعالجها. فيش يعني اديب اللي عنده الامكانيه اللي يعيش انه على الحدود يعني بنقول اللغويه او الحدود السياسيه بين الشعبين. انا نصي عربي ونصي اسرائيلي يعني. الماضي تبعي
وين اليهودية بين الشغلتين؟
نفس اليهودي اللي كانت في اللي عندي في العراق. فأنا يعني كشخص أنا أختلف عن كل يهودي في داخل إسرائيل. ولذلك أحد المقالات كتبت أنه شكل دولة ذات شخص واحد، حزب ذات شخص واحد مع سكولة واحدة.
So Sami proposed the formula of one nation for one person. If we were to see each single individual as a denominator for a social group, could we dismiss questions of belonging and identity? To give a bit of a context to these stories, the decolonization of South Asia and the Middle East in the late 40s resulted in the partition of the subcontinent, Arabization of Iraq, and the Palestinian Nakba. These were efforts to create more or less homogeneous nations, and the resulting forced transfer of populations dislocated millions of people from their homes. 17 years on, people are still struggling to express what does home mean to them. So the conversations which you heard are recordings from the Home Project. While working on this project, I asked people to remember and describe the home they once used to live in and that they were forced to leave. Now, it's remarkable to me that these stories do not so much center on the loss of property. Rather, people mourn the loss of continuity and the loss of their idiosyncratic identities. Salim Tamari, who's a Palestinian sociologist, told me what they robbed was the pattern of daily life, of mundane activities, which would still have been there if the exile had not taken place. So what was lost? Ordinary experiences and the ability to pass on these experiences, like a loss of spending time, performing daily rituals, or wearing specific clothes. Of existing, simply existing within a social space. So these stories are evidence of loss, loss of entangled identities. These losses seem to have caused heartbreak. Let's look at another place. I once saw the maps of Matrace Nosu. Nosu was a 16th century Bosnian cartographer and a janissary. Janissaries were an elite guard to the Ottoman Sultan. Now, I was wondering, it's a proposition, could we not compare these dreamscapes to the capital cities of modern Europe? His sketches depict cities which seem ordered, secure and rich, cultured, but unattainable, out of reach. The people occupying these cities, the, so to say, dreamscapers, are probably unaware and unconcerned about the landscape of labor below. The landscape appears like a vast, unending plain, broken up by many larger and smaller hills. Now, these hills are the zone of industrial activity, the place of employment. The slopes are the place of the workers. semi-skilled, unskilled day laborers, peasants, uneducated working women, child workers, and a great mobility and fluidity prevails at the slopes of the hills. The slopes are where the unlucky compete for the ultimate prize, a place in those distant cities. People on these slopes often risk everything, including their lives and the lives of their loved ones, in a desperate bid to reach the mount. Hill dwellers call them immigrants, economic migrants, refugees, or just aliens. Hill officials categorize them as documented or undocumented, legal or illegal. In 2007, I spoke to young men from Lahore and Bombay who were unskilled, underemployed, and quite desperate to migrate to America. They did not consider Pakistan or India as their property. They could not sell their labor in the markets of their home countries. Yet they did not belong to America either. Now, I asked them to describe what America, the ultimate hilltop of their dreams, meant to them. Please meet Muhammad Qurban Ali, who talked about the impossibility of getting to America.
मुझे भी जाना चाहिए, लेकिन मैं इतना अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकता कि मैं बाहर चला जाऊँ आसानी से. अगर अमेरिका होता ये हमारे पाकिस्तान की दूसरी साइड पे, शायद मैं गोली से भी ना डरता, मैं अमेरिका में जाकर दाखिल हो जाता.
But I cannot afford to go abroad easily. If America was on the other side of Pakistan, maybe I wouldn't even be afraid for a bullet and would have entered somehow. But America is very far, across 7 seas. How will I see it? But my heart says it is beautiful. My mind says it is very beautiful. People over there are also very beautiful.
So the hilltop represents an elusive desire for a secure existence, which is worth giving one's life for. Now this brings me to the final stop. And let me return to my rambles through London. I once walked around the city with a Pakistani friend, and she showed me statues of imperial figures, generals like Clive, Havelock, Gordon, Napier, I can go on. Now, looking at these statues of imperial glory and pride, she remarked, I don't know why they are still up there, being their unchallenged imperial selves. We could add Victoria, the Empress of India, to that list, and here she is in Wakefield. In 2012, I made a work called The Silent Empress, and it was a work of precarious iconoclasm which was intended as a make-believe apology for Europe's imperial colonization. Now, the work was prompted by my walks, but also by instances like these. You may remember the 2010 Poppy skirmish, where David Cameron insisted on his right of free speech and wore a Remembrance Day poppy in China. Now, he may have professed unawareness of the heartbreak that the English poppy had brought to the Chinese people. Another such instance was during World War II in the eastern parts of India. A hyperinflation caused by government policies diverting resources to the war effort resulted in the Bengal famine. Some 2 million people died. Now, allegedly, the then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had said that relief would do no good, Indians breed like rabbits and will outstrip any available food supply. I used gems like these to make an ornament which I mounted onto the statue of Queen Victoria. Now, it was in shape of an absurd monologue, which I sourced from quotes from politicians. And I made Victoria say that she was sorry. The work made the council members in Wakefield very angry. Now, initially the council had given permission to stage this work. They had agreed to it. But once they saw this, they immediately demanded for it to be pulled down. And I'll play you the dialogue that took place.
I now know Britain's rise to global preeminence was partially dependent on a system of colonial slave labor. That what would now be a crime against humanity was legal in my time. Liberty for ourselves, empire over the rest of mankind. Yes, it is an awful moment to have to give up one's innocence.
So it ran for about half an hour, but in the rage of the council officials, I witnessed a heartbreak too. Perhaps that was a heartbreak of losing an empire. Now, you may have followed the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford. One of the arguments against taking the Rhodes statue at Oriel College down was, once you start removing one statue, you'd have to remove so many more, it would simply not be possible. Well, it's possible. However, should we not rather let the statues speak? Now, at the onset, I asked, what is art, what is progress, and what is memory? These terms are permanently renegotiated throughout human history. Or to speak with Hamad's lecture last week, these terms need to be repaired after every rainy season. Now, I think our job is to work out what progress, memory, and art will mean to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Like me, I'm sure all of you are buzzing with a million questions, and I will ask you to note them down. We will pick them up at the end of the presentation. Moving swiftly on, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Syed Adrus, who lives between London and Bern, who did his BFA at the Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham before moving on to the Goldsmiths for postgraduate studies. And in his practice, through a variety of media, from painting to public art to films and installations, Adrus explores issues of migration, mobility, and diaspora. He is shown at the 4th Havana Biennale in Cuba. He was part of the historic Transforming the Crown exhibition at the Bronx Museum in New York, a Change Directory at Kunsthal Bern, and his Pavilion project that he will be speaking about today was featured both at Tate Britain and at the Southampton Museum and Art Gallery in 2006. More recently, he had a solo show called Non-Places in Bergdorf in Switzerland, and was part of the exhibition The Place Is Here at Nottingham Contemporary. Said, could I ask you to come up here? And let me just make sure we...
I thought a lot about it, yet kind of as an artist I've been kind of working on themes which are similar and overlapping with this particular theme. But in a way, these definitions and terms have played an important role not only for artists but for historians, not only in contemporary context today in Britain, in my particular kind of practice when I graduated in the 80s, mid-80s, there was a lot of issue about race and community, and there was like a black artists which were what you call African, Caribbean, Asian, and there were several exhibitions, and there's a revisit happening now. So within that context, I think ultimately it's the art. So in a sense, how good is the art? It's up to different people in different contexts to judge. So ultimately, for me personally, even within this talk, I try to say that one is trying to create. The labels and the issues are important, but they kind of permeate and move around. I thought being this particular talk in 2017, I thought my kind of talk is mainly about the Pavilion project that Hamad said is an important project for me because I spent over 10 years on and off. And this project is actually not part of the Pavilion project, but I'm showing this couple of images because this place is a Bonington Gallery, Nottingham Trent, where I studied. And many years later, I was a student in 1982, and in 1999, I had a one-person show called In Exile. So it was kind of a multi kind of media exhibition with projections and sound and 27 jute bags. Each bag represented kind of my political exile, if so to speak. I was born in East Africa. My parents were born in India. And anyway, it's a long colonial kind of context. I thought that within this kind of Pavilion series, the issues about war and conflict, my father was involved in Kenya, part of the British Army before the independence of East African countries in the 60s and before the Indian independence of 1947. So the entanglement kind of happens not only within Britain and South Asia, it kind of within this context moves around, in my case, with East Africa. So I thought I'd show a couple of examples. And this is a detail of that project where I had monitors within certain sacks. Now the sacks represented a kind of thing about people traveling, like a cargo, like trade, but even like people traveling, you know, maybe from India to Kenya, Mombasa. And the stories that I used to hear from my parents sometimes, the conditions in 30s of 1940s, must have been quite difficult. So anyway, this was kind of a feeling that maybe I wanted to kind of capture in that context. So the thing is, this exhibition started in October 1999 in Nottingham. And anyway, eventually the gallery curator said it's going to start on 7th of October. And that was a date of my father who died in 1982 whilst I was a student. So 17 years became quite kind of thinking about it. He was 17 when he left India to go to East Africa. I was 17 when I came from Switzerland to UK. And then we have 2017 today. So some reason I had to include this couple of images as a backdrop. But quite an important part of my work. Moving on, with reference to the work that I was involved in about issues about portraiture and identity, some of the work in the 80s and 90s, I was trained as a painter and printmaker, largely as undergraduate studies, and I did a lot of painting with image and text. And then in the 90s, I was experimenting with computer drawings and some kind of scans and early IT technology. But anyway, this is part of a kind of a video work, and the crown of this notion of belonging of British passport or whatever is projected like a tattoo on me. So anyway, this particular one is called On the Spot. Like one is on the spot now. It's quite an important piece of work because in a way it's kind of talking about a lot of issues to me in terms of not only the notions of portraiture, visually, aesthetically, but kind of with reference to belongings. And I still think that one can belong to several spaces, several countries, and why not? And with notions of affinity to a place and your loyalty or whatever, I think in some cases within the South Asian diaspora, in my case, I feel that, I don't know, I haven't chosen, sometimes I have chosen to be part of Britain, in a way I've decided to be here for a long time. But in a way, some of my circumstances, a lot of us, we don't choose, our parents choose, or whatever circumstances with reference to migration or economically. And it's all right. I mean, I speak German, I speak Swahili, I speak some Hindi, Gujarati. I feel at home in India, I feel at home in Britain. Sometimes I don't feel at home in Britain, sometimes I don't feel at home in India. It's okay, it doesn't matter. You know? So part of those sort of things and conversations have kind of sipped into my practice and the discourses around it. Right. This is the project called, kind of loosely speaking, Pavilion Series. It's a project that I kind of came across maybe 2003, 2004, in terms of, it's a place in Woking, in Surrey, and it's part of what you call a Muslim burial ground. This photograph is taken outside a particular site, which is, you could see that in the distance there is a little bit of wall desecrated and this entrance of a dome pavilion. This place was, I think, built in 1917 to bury the Indian soldiers from the First World War. So there are, of course, Indian soldiers in terms of Muslims. The Hindus and Sikhs who died in Brighton were cremated just outside Brighton, and a memorial called Chhatri Memorial. I came across this through my dear friend Bhajan, who is here. She had done some work in Woking around a particular place, I think this the oldest mosque in the country, called the Shah Jahan Mosque. So this architecture in this sort of so-called suburbia, Woking outside the city, I thought it was really interesting, fascinating. Yet this particular burial ground didn't have any graves. The graves had been moved in the 1960s, late 60s, to another site. So anyway, I was kind of the conversations happened, and I said, oh, I don't know whether I want to kind of spend my few years visiting graves and things like that. It was really difficult. I kind of tried to shy away from it. But here talking about post 9/11 situation, where mosques, certain architecture with so-called Islamic kind of features, Islam is in kind of context in the media, etc. I was kind of interested around that time, these notions of topography of British cities were changing. This is before Tate Modern, before a lot of new museums were built in Britain. And I was kind of interested in certain mosques in Birmingham. I lived in Birmingham, Nottingham. Small mosques, big mosques were being built. Temples were being built in Neasden, northwest London. Very kind of architecture which was actually changing the British cities. I thought there's really interesting things were happening before the sexy art museums like the Turner or, I don't know, different kind of new build spaces like the Walsall came into existence. Whether you like it or not, things were changing. I thought, yeah, it's interesting that we have this sort of architecture within kind of southeast, the home counties, which has got a really strong connection to Asia, not only kind of in terms of history of a certain amount of people or a number of people who were resident at that time, but this kind of entangled history as this particular course and this kind of discourse is taking place. So I did a series of photographs, recordings, and became part of like work in progress, moving images and small videos and things like that. Eventually it became like a project in 2006 in Woking and Southampton. In Southampton Museum, I had the opportunity to show large-scale photographs of this series. So I have a few examples here and trying to kind of go into it a little bit. This is another photograph as you enter. That the previous one was from a distance. But what happened here was, I thought it would be an interesting space. I visited several times, but that plaque, maybe most of you would not be able to see properly. There's an NF sign there, kind of, you know, National Front. There was a lot of desecration that was happening in the 50s post-war, from small-scale graffiti to, I think, desecration of the graves. And then the Commonwealth Graves Commission, apparently in my research, decided that they had to remove these graves, the remains, and rebury them in the military section in the same town. So this project has got like part of the research was in Brighton, where the Indian soldiers, when I've been Indian before the partition of 47, which was India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they were wounded in a way, from Belgium and France. The reason why these Asian soldiers, if I may call it Asian, were in Britain were because they were wounded. If they died in France and Belgium. Or if they survived, they just went back, or they were sent back. So it's quite interesting. They kind of were, in a way, in Britain in the First World War, and there were a lot of them who were part of this particular war effort. So I thought it was kind of interesting, this whole thing about loyalty, issues of loyalty and affinity to a place. Post 9/11, what happened in New York, the question whether your Muslim name, your Muslim religion, where are you? Do you belong here? Are you part of us? Are you not part of us? And I thought that instead of looking at it very directly, as my particular work in the 80s was about identity, like really portraiture and this and about race, I thought it really interesting. Let's move away from these notions of portraiture, representation is a body and figuration, and let's look into something that is within this terrain, if you like, not far from London, in our British, extremely connected. It's a Grade 2 listed building. It still exists today. It has what you call refurbishment happened, but there's a different story, a different discourse. So there was this kind of Brighton, Woking, and I thought it was really fascinating. So there's issues of loyalty and citizenship, that they were loyal to the crown. So that's kind of the take I was taking. But I was kind of moved by the space, the architecture, what happened, what it was used for, what it was created for, and what it became, and what is it now. So I kind of loosely call it Pavilion Series, because Brighton Pavilion was kind of central to this. Now, this is the oldest mosque, which still exists in Woking, in the same town, a kilometer away from the previous photograph site. This is called the Shah Jahan Mosque. It's got an interesting history. I think in my research it says there was a queen of Bhopal in India called Shah Jahan, and she funded largely this particular mosque. And it was built in 1889. It still exists. It's a very beautiful small mosque in Woking. The reason why the previous burial ground was built was the mosque had already kind of existed, so to speak. So they wanted to bury the Muslim soldiers from Brighton who were kind of, they were in a hospital at the Brighton Pavilion in various places in the southeast. So they brought some of them the First World War, about 19, I think. Anyway, in this particular site, and because kind of the prayers, the mosque had existed. So I thought it was really interesting, this kind of trajectory of the spaces. And this is the third site. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Anyway, this is where the reburial of these particular graves from the previous burial ground. So this is what you call Brookwood Cemetery, and this happened in the late 60s. Now, Brookwood Cemetery, if some of you might know, or assuming that you might not know, that it's a massive cemetery in the same town in Woking. It's a huge cemetery, actually. There were burials taking place from like 19th century from London, and they got a large military cemetery, even today, Commonwealth Soldiers Cemetery. So part of that, like what you call people who died, Canadian, Australian, etc., Commonwealth soldiers, they created a particular site for this reburial for the soldiers from the First World War in the other side. So it's kind of a dislocation happening within the, if you like, when they're dead. So this sort of thing was kind of mainly, which was the kind of the crutch of the project, showing and depicting these different sites. And you can see the uniformity of these particular graves, like any soldier, just the fact that the names and the regiment and something important about their faith is. So here we have, this is actually a group exhibition which took place in Nottingham, and part of the project was that I showed the previous series of photographs and created a new work called Fragile Handle with Care, which kind of emerged from all this sort of time, if you like, as I said, 9/11, the issues about belonging and affinity to place. At the same time, I think it's kind of a very sensitive issue, and kind of how the media went haywire on it, and the rest is history. But it's still there, it's around us, and this is the stuff that has kind of bothered me. But it's very hard. How do you deal with something that you're kind of close to, this theme? And I kind of try to explore it in my own way. If perhaps people who are not aware, these wooden rests are actually called rihals. They're used in Sikh temples and even, I think, Hindu temples, but definitely in mosques. When I was young, I read the Quran, and the Quran rests on it, and they're called rihals. And I put some Arabic script on it in different kind of situation. And it's about kind of learning of the Quran and learning the Arabic, the classical Arabic. And I felt it's kind of an interesting kind of debate around this notions of whether you're brainwashed or you're not, or whatever. But it's a very kind of fragile, very important, fragile issue which still exists today. Moving forward, right, as part of this, am I slow or quick, whatever? Just, that's 5 more minutes? Okay. Anyway, the quick kind of rendition, I thought the work was mainly two-dimensional, largely photographs from the Pavilion project. And I'm kind of experimenting, because I had done some short films and a couple of small installation moving imagery. This is another kind of animation thing I'm trying to explore as part of the Pavilion, how it could be developed with partners to show as projections or stills or light boxes, and how things could be triggered around a particular theme, perhaps like Pavilion. So it was just a kind of very simple animation. To fast forward the situation, last few images or the slides would be of a project which actually relates to Pavilion, definitely, but with this kind of museum feel, and actually using element of my father who was in Kenya in the Second World War, sort of entangled within that situation. And this exhibition took place in Nottingham in 2014-15. This is the entrance, and tried to create like a museum-like kind of feel. On the right here, further right, is actually information about a particular book, the army book that my father had, and became like an information panel, between an information panel and an artwork. This is basically a very simple kind of projection of archival film and objects, creating like a, kind of trying to retrieve that particular project or theme, so recaptured as aesthetically, photographically, how you retrieve and capture. Capture as a captive notion of a soldier being captured. And I was trying to play on these words of capture, captive. This is very important here. The central figure here is King George V, if I'm correct. Royal Pavilion, Brighton, and the Indian soldiers, and some of them who might have died were actually buried in the aerial images that I showed you of Muslim burial ground. This film is really interesting. I'm not showing you moving image, just a couple of slides of it. This was a propaganda film created in 1915, not only to recruit more people from India or Pakistan, or India in those days before the partition, but local recruits in the southeast as well. So it was a kind of thing that the royalties visiting the wounded, and we're going to take care of you, and the Royal Pavilion Brighton was used as a hospital. It's a really moving Pathe film, and I've used it in my installation in several ways, either through another color kind of film or as part of a black and white on its own. And this is a Victoria Cross given to one particular person at that time. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting thing that's happening in. And this particular medal is from my father, the family still got it, and it's King George VI, because it was awarded in 1944. So it's quite an interesting kind of connections to King George and the colonial context here. This is the army book, which is used in the exhibition in Nottingham, Pavilion Recaptured. It's a detail of that project. I think this might be the final image, I think. But anyway, this actually is, quite a fascinating, falling apart a record, a document. So it's sort of a project that has kind of all these different kind of histories and entanglements and things like that, but kind of very personal. And I tried to kind of use that. The reason I showed you the earlier images from Nottingham Trent was that this kind of thing about my father died, and he kind of, when I was a student, and it happened to have an exhibition 17 years exactly after he died. It was in 1999, and I kind of felt that it's very important to use those images and show. So I think this is the final one of my father and his colleagues in Kenya. I think so. That's about it. Oh yeah, maybe that's the last one.
Thank you, Said. Again, I think those lists of questions and comments are growing, and we will come back to them. You've added to that the city on the hill that Sophie started us off with, to the challenge of living in multiple hills at the same time. And to add to that challenge, I want to introduce our final speaker. David Ailsworth is a Bristol-based artist who divides his time between the UK and Pakistan and holds both passports, so somebody also used to living with entangled histories and presence. Ailsworth's work echoes his long engagement with Pakistan as an art educator, as a horticultural consultant, and as a visual artist. So the idea of the garden as an archival formation across cultures is central to his practice. David has a BFA from Wimbledon College of Art, an MFA from the Transart Institute in Berlin, and in the 1990s was a pivotal member of the group that's been labeled Karachi Pop. He moved to Lahore in 2006, and his work has been exhibited widely, including at the Asian Art Triennial in Fukuoka in Japan, at the 3rd Asia Pacific Triennale in Brisbane, at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai, at the Mohata Palace Museum in Karachi, and more recently at the 8th Berlin Biennale and the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. David, if I could ask you to come up. 20 minutes. Right?
Thank you, Hamad, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the Paul Mellon Institute for this opportunity to share something of my practice. My grandfather was a horticulturalist, and a rose is named after him. A rose my mother always said was particularly hideous. And he died when I was very young. However, he's someone I now meet on the internet. There are still horticultural awards given in his name. And as a 5-year-old, he taught me my first botanical name, which was Acer palmatum dissectum autopurpureum. And, henceforth, horticulture, gardens, art making, and teaching have been the various poles of my life. Moving forward some 40 years, I consciously decided to collapse my gardening and landscape interests and art making ambitions into the same place. This is the result of a long overdue MFA at Transart Institute in Berlin. Here I encountered, amongst much else, Foucault's theory of the heterotopia. and the garden as a sort of happy universalizing heterotopia. This was a work that was begun in 2007, and with much editing and re-embroidery was completed finally in 2010. This was one of 2 carpets that were wrecked, but antique rugs that I'd been hauling around in my life for almost a decade. Knowing that somehow I wanted to reanimate them in some way through my work. And here's part of the 3rd principle of Michel Foucault's Heterotopia in translation. A wonderful and inspiring text of carpets and gardens and otherness. It spoke to me directly of my own experience of the gardens of southern England and then of Pakistan, which has been my second home for almost 30 years. Garden palimpsest also drew upon many other ideas. Jean Delegris' 1790 rendition of the estate of the Palace of Versailles made almost 100 years into its existence at a point where many of the trees had already been cut down and replanted. A very young André Lenotte had briefly studied with a painter, Simon Vouet, who was at that point undertaking a residency in the Palace of the Louvre. And here he encountered Simon Vouet's own youthful studies of Islamic tile work from Constantinople. And this is an influence I choose to believe is part of Lenotte's vision for the Garden of Versailles, built for the Sun King. At the center of the Paradise carpets, particularly evident in Kashan's and Kaman's, is the depiction of the Charbagh, here shown in this study of the gardens of the Taj Mahal. The Charbagh, or 4-quartered Garden of Eden, Paradise, or Jannat, lies at the heart of all the Abrahamic faiths. The Grand Canal of Versailles is here laid over the nucleus of the Charbagh, creating a sort of cross-cultural dialogue of water. In one, it's used as a tool of power and for grandeur. In the other, as a most precious resource, its presence is only vaguely hinted at. Another key influence and the genesis of this work was the franchising the Louvre's collections to Abu Dhabi. And interestingly, Abu Dhabi have recently acquired this work for their national collection. I take the Oriental carpet as a broad cultural signifier, not as a particular geographical marker. The carpet here, once much larger and extremely finely knotted, is now more of a Turin shroud than a lush Oriental rug. But this allowed me to dare to embroider into it, and the wear of these carpets with their invisible histories inscribed upon them is extremely important to me. The carpets host these embroidered interventions, but are essentially unchanged by it. In fact, in their making, there is much editing and undoing, for I can only see the immediate work area most of the time. The rest of it is rolled up, as I have to access both sides. It's often disappointing when I do actually get to lay them out for checking on the studio floor, taking them off the frames I use to support them for embroidery, and frequently demands much unpicking of stitches. Here is the garden palimpsest in the Agahan Museum in Toronto at their inaugural exhibition, curated by Shamini Pereira. The cutout in the floor behind it goes down to the museum collection below, and directly underneath is a massive, exquisite 15th century carpet. So it was, a fantastic opportunity to see my work in that context. But unfortunately, everything's lit at 100 lux maximum for archival reasons, which is actually not an ideal level of light to see anything. this carpet that isn't actually a carpet, though is based upon one, but is not for walking on, reminds me of the medieval sunken garden, like the 19th century copy I used to visit in the gardens of Hampton Court Palace as a child. I actually just found out that it's actually a 19th century copy. But here the garden is a conceptual or spiritual space that cannot actually be entered, and it's not the recreational space of today's gardens. And for these medieval gardeners and their copies, the gardeners would use a ladder to go down into the garden to maintain it. And here at the Pera Museum in Istanbul, where I really enjoyed the excessive isolation of the plinth. The V&A curators wanted to light my carpet works here as they would their own antique carpets in the V&A. And I had to keep asking for the lights to be turned up. For although both the carpets shown were antique and definitely distressed, they were not of any historical significance nor of great age or value, in themselves, that is. This brings me to the second work in an ongoing series of these garden carpet works. Hyde Park, Kashan of 1862, which I finished in 2011. I intended it as an ongoing exploration of Western garden history, the Italianate Baroque of Versailles, giving way to English Romanticism some 300 years later. Though both gardens were also royal parks and spaces of privilege. Here, the great exhibition of 1862 is depicted from the Stanford mapping of that date, which the work is based upon. The exhibition site is the edge of the Albertopolis on Cromwell Road today. Albert had died at only 42 the year before, and Victoria in mourning had not attended its opening. Many of the adjacent street names echo feudal and monarchic power. And although much remains the same as today, there are some interesting changes in land use. In this carpet, the serpentine continues as a dialogue of water across cultures, overlaying the charbagh of the Kashan beneath. I used a Singer 733 for this transparent chadar-like stitching. And as a sculptor, one is always looking for the perfect tool and never finding it, because there clearly is no such thing. And here's the Singer 733 in my old Lahore studio. And this was in manufacture from around 1860 up until the 1940s. And there are still a few at work in Pakistan, mostly with cobblers, for stitching through the soles of shoes. It was originally designed for the stitching of lifting tackle and the making of ship sails. For this project, it took 5 people to operate it, which is not very practical at all. In fact, it didn't actually speed things up at all. But it did produce a nice even stitch. And I'm still lugging this huge chunk of metal around in my life. This is a Stanford map fragment I based the work upon. I love the Stanford maps. I love their graphics and their palettes. Map makers and carpet makers would both seem to suffer from the same horror vacui, the need to populate all empty spaces, that I would seem to suffer from myself. I am definitely not of the school, or rather I am definitely of the school that more is more. In these works, I use hundreds or thousands of embroidered trees to subdue the carpet beneath. By this, I mean to find a balance between the existing carpet design and my own intervention. I look for colors that come from the carpet or harmonize with the carpet's own palette for the most part. This is the base carpet for that work. After almost 10 years of hauling it around in my life, I had to cut it down, cut it in half, and then rejoin it, and try to extract as many kilos of dust from it as I could prior to embarking on the embroidery project. Another showing of the work, this time in London, in sight of the Royal Parks and just off Trafalgar Square, with all its connotations of empire. There was a Kashan carpet in my own childhood, and I believe all art making is essentially autobiographical, whether we acknowledge it or not. This particular carpet was room-sized, and I played upon it as a small child. It was my kingdom, and I felt safe behind its implied walls, the walls of paradise. Paradesa, being Avestan or ancient Persian for a brick wall. My sisters promptly skipped it upon my parents' death, which I'm sure is yet another motivating force in my engagement with these carpet works. Having now worked alone on a carpet with the Pakistan projects, I did have people working with me, and it was a very communal activity. But I've now worked on a carpet for several years on my own, seeking new and valuable insights through that lonely process. And I can report that I have found something. The current Kashan that I'm embroidering, a relatively new specimen, not excessively worn, I found to contain a kind of emotional mapping of the carpet weaver. By this point, I've worked on every square foot of it. I find huge changes in the density of the warp and weft. Sometimes, my own stitches pulling right through the pile of the carpet, and at other times, requiring pliers to get the large wool embroidery needle through the pile. This being nothing to do with the wear pattern on the carpet or the density of the pile. It's purely to do with how it's been packed down. The carpet works take me years to produce, even with help, which I can no longer afford. It takes excessive amounts of time, and I've always been wanting to build further context for them. So with the showing at the Berlin Biennale in 2014, I had the opportunity to undertake a project that had been germinating for a very long time, which was a collection of trees of Pakistan. Initially, it was going to be a collection of the painted trees of Pakistan, because in Pakistan, trees are frequently painted. A kind of Chinese whisper of an idea that once upon a time you painted fruit trees with catechu and lime to stop climbing insects. In this case, it's a eucalypt, and the stripes have got well out of control. And I wanted to do this collection of the painted trees of Pakistan, but I ended up calling it the Trees of Pakistan. And I thought that I would relate it somehow to Flora Indica. Flora Indica was the herbaria commissioned by the East India Company at around 1790 from Dr. Roxburgh, who in the course of charting the plants of the subcontinent named a few species after himself, like Pinus roxburghii. And he hired 2 miniature painters to produce the renditions of the plants. And when the treaties went back to Kew Gardens, many eyebrows were raised about the look of the botanical work, which was significantly different. So I worked with Shakila Hedda, who is a graduate of National College of Arts, a fairly recent graduate, and we continue to work together from time to time. I wouldn't call it a collaboration as such, but that's a whole nother discourse perhaps. But this is another of the works in that series of 12 works, Alistonia scalaris, also known as the devil's tree. It has a habit of dropping healthy branches on people and killing them. And that's Nawaz Sharif's political emblem, the tiger. The recently ex-Prime Minister of Pakistan. And this is the Main Market barber shop tree, Mimosops elengii. And I also created botanical labels, or they're not really accession labels, but they contain the location and the Latin name, the local name of the plants. And I worked with a calligrapher from Mumbai to produce those. And another work in the series, in the ongoing series, is the Kant Runner of 2012. When I went to Lahore, I found myself living in R.A. Bazaar. And for a while, I didn't realize it was Royal Artillery Bazaar. And I didn't realize that down the road, cavalry lines were in fact native cavalry lines. And then, gradually, it unfolded to me that the new Lahore Kant, Mian Mir Kant, was a very definite response to the First War of Independence in 1857, where the British civil station was moved out from Anarkali to Mian Mir. And the Mall was built as a linking road. And here we see what is definitely an army at rest. The general's quarters, the church, the cricket ground, the tennis court are all at its center, along with the post office, I'm sure. And hierarchically around it are what amounts to an army at rest: native infantry lines, native cavalry lines, Royal Artillery Bazaar where I was living, and so on and so forth. And here's the mapping up against it. I'm going to do another mapping of this. This carpet was a bit of a disaster, in the sense that the pile was so thick that a lot of the embroidery lost itself into it. But as one goes forth, one learns new things about how to manage this. And here we can see a period mapping that is showing the old city of Lahore and Mian Mir Kant down to the lower right-hand corner, looking for all the world like an airport. A very strong statement of separateness and unentanglement, perhaps, at this point. And this is where I would purchase my carpets on Nicholson Road, having a second life, having been gathered in the villages of Iran, but also Quetta, Baluchistan, brought down to the auction houses in Lahore to go on and have a second life, perhaps in my studio. And I think I'll stop there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, David. I'll just invite the artists to come up and join me. And we will pass another mic on. We have about 20 odd minutes to go, and what I will do, I have a number of questions prepared, but I will hold them in check. But maybe I'll start with one. And while we're asking the artists to respond, it would be great if you can sort of think about what you would like to address to one more or to all of them, and then we can continue that conversation. And I'm not going to try and summarize what we've just heard, because we've been on such a rich journey, from the hill to being buried to being the carpet as shroud. There are so many different images that are playing in my mind. But maybe one of the things that I would love to get all of your responses to is, and Sophie, when you were talking about, I think one of the images that you left in my mind was this idea of when we try and disentangle an entanglement, you almost always do violence to them. And in some ways, I was just thinking about the experiences that you yourselves, as people who lead entangled lives, as to how you use time in your own practices. So the projects that all three of you have described this is also being recorded and it's live streamed, so when you speak, if you speak into the mic.
I won't be able to speak at all. Time in terms of my life. Well, I mean, my life's been full of disjunctures of one kind or another. I suppose going to Pakistan in the first place in the 80s, late 80s, was a kind of huge disjunction. But then I was living in, you know, the buzzing mega city of Karachi and was involved in what you, I think, would point as Karachi Pop, quite rightly so. And time had a very different connotation in that environment from, you know, some almost 20 years later when I moved to Lahore into, you know, the city of culture, perhaps, Pakistan, but also a very agrarian pace to life. I mean, people there will still today say, you know, I'll meet you next Tuesday, but turn up several days later and think nothing of it, almost on a kind of farmer's calendar. But certainly working on the carpet projects on my own, where I listen to a lot of audio books and catch up on things that I perhaps wouldn't otherwise read. And really they demand 8 or 10 hours of work a day, and like everyone else, I spend most of my days Googling or responding to emails, which I try to do when I'm embroidering. Doesn't really work. But, you know, time is a funny thing in one's life, and I think, you know, as an artist, there are different phases of time and how you manage things through your life. But in terms of unentangling, I've decided not to untangle myself. I'm going to stay, you know, very tightly enmeshed and entangled, woven into the fabric of things, and I'm going to be back in Pakistan as much as I possibly can, because that's where there is meaning in my life.
Time's right. It's quite interesting. Not quite sure that I'll answer it in kind of exactly the way you might ask. The process in terms of working on a particular project, like Pavilion, as I just briefly kind of showed, taking several years, I tend to work in series. For example, I still do work in printmaking. We have this kind of old-style printmaking process, a printer actually, pressed in this old metal in the studio. And I quite like working in series. So things kind of change after several months or maybe after 1 or 2 years. So that kind of, in terms of its medium, thinking about the Pavilion project, I tell you what, I kind of dabbled a little bit in print, in film, Super 8 and one or two of the video. But I hadn't really made short films or installation type moving images. So in that respect, kind of media had an effect, partly because in terms of this project I'm talking about, really, had a kind of significant part is actually archival research in terms of old puppet films, or in particular archive for Southeast Film and Video Archive based at Brighton University, which is kind of where the place of the art school is, Brighton Art School. And it's actually stone's throw away from the Royal Pavilion Brighton. So I kind of, a very different way of working. Of course, in the past, before that, prior to that, I hadn't really worked in that way. It's a very solitary activity as an artist, and that is okay, it's right. But in a way, some of this kind of collective effort, or meetings, or meeting people, and exchanging information, and getting involved with a friend of mine who actually helped him edit the films and digitally kind of work with me on the project was really useful. So that kind of media thing, I can kind of talk maybe positively about it. At the same time, this project started, and I realized, for example, in Britain, anniversaries are a big thing. And this 2014, the centenary of the First World War. So the kind of project had taken kind of different thing and almost finished beforehand. So I kind of wasn't aware of what kind of centenary taking place there across my mind. But somehow, some space, through kind of partnerships or discussions about possible project, a project came around in 2014. So in a sense, it had a kind of a, I don't know, coincidental kind of approach, if I may say so.
Yeah, Ahmad, you asked, I think you referred to the home project when you say it takes a lot of time. It was a project of many, many years. That, of course, had to do with it being documentary work and conversations that I collected. So talking to people takes time, and also talking truly to people takes time because you will have to talk again and again to them. But I think that is about the process of making, as we also saw in David's work and in Said's work. The process of making a work takes time, and this engagement then is also the way our ideas develop. But I think more important, the home project is about now, and it is about, and also what I try to show with the presentation is all these works that I've shown deal with a problem we are facing, or questions, let's say, questions we're facing now, which ask of us a certain responsibility, like a political or a collective responsibility to the society we live in. So, okay, making work takes time, but it's about this particular moment.
I think you left it at a very poised and a really interesting point. And maybe it's where we open this up, or before we continue.
This does follow on from your question, Hamad, but I guess the question I'd like to ask the three of you is about how all of you are historians as much as artists, and it seems to me, and I wonder if your interest in history, which of course is a long-standing interest of certain categories of art practice, you think of the 18th century history painting as seen as the pinnacle of art practice, but I wonder if your active engagement with history in all of your work is something that you see in pretty much all your artistic contemporaries, or do you see yourselves standing outside a lot of their preoccupations? It's really a reflection on whether you see your interest in history as very current and common in your peer group or not.
That's an interesting question. I never saw myself as somebody who was interested in history until perhaps I got historical myself. And I lived in a city like Lahore. I mean, all the years I spent in Karachi and prior to that, there was too much happening in the immediate present, and I wasn't facing history in that way. And I think when I moved to Lahore, as much as anything else, I began to see myself as a kind of colonial trace through the eyes of everyone who saw me, representing something that wasn't necessarily of myself. People, as they often do in Pakistan, would speak to me about Cannon Doyle's London or something like that. But it has been an aspiration of mine to host a research-based practice, but now I'm at a point where I'm thinking maybe that's just another excuse to avoid issues of taste. But I do, at this point in my life, I do trend towards that, and I'm trying to dig into the history of Bristol and Sedan as my immediate area at the moment to try and ground myself and find a possibility of making work in that environment.
Very interesting question. It's really hard to wear a hat of a historian, but I can see that in one of the presentations, in particular mine, the history is kind of relevant in terms of research. But I think in my practice, last 25 years, so it makes me feel very young. I think the practice itself has changed, largely personally speaking. The perception of the work that I produce has kind of changed. The times are different. It doesn't mean that I'm kind of looking into a practice of long-winded kind of academic itself, when I was graduating, was taught, even people who taught me, that some of them didn't even have masters. So in a sense, the practice itself has changed. But I don't think that one needs to really go into that deep. But I think within the context of my photographs, the photographic series, I have this kind of, I still feel a sense of, I'm contemporizing a particular issue or theme, and in a way this historical aspect within what's here and now. So with my kind of notion of revisiting a site, and they were ruins essentially. They are a ruin in Woking. So I kind of feel, yeah, there are elements like that. Like I did drawings and things like that. Yeah, so in a sense, history does seep into it like other things. Maybe in the past, maybe identity-wise, I was using the language kind of portraiture idea was slightly different. But within the other kind of contemporaries, I'm not quite sure it's there.
Yeah, I think I agree with you when you say you take from history and you said you contemporize it. Am I right? So that's what you said. So I think historians would ask very different questions than artists ask history. And I think for me, art is a way to engage with our world here now, and through questions, and that you can do that through asking questions to history, but I think to a different end than a historian, and whether it's something that many artists do, that's a very different. I think that's an answer. How much?
But context of it, isn't it?
I'm not going to take too much time, but there's obviously what questions coming.
You can do it? Okay, thanks. I just wanted to pick up on a comment that David made about in the image where you had lines of control. You mentioned marks and making is autobiographical, if I'm correct. And I was just thinking of a quote from Hélène Cixous when she wrote Mon Algériens, My Algeria. She said, to weave a flying carpet, I felt perfectly at home nowhere. And she's using this, as I'm assuming, in notions of freedom that obliges her to let go and to, she suggests, beat her wings. And it's only in the act of writing, creativity. So I'm just wondering for all three of you whether you could bring that mark making to your own practice, whether it's lines of walking, uncovering, or carpeting, in whatever form you'd like. I'm just very interested in that concept.
Well, it's a very poetic question. And I think when recently I've been embroidering Sweetwater canals into a mapping of Lawrence Gardens in Lahore, which is a botanical garden in British Empire, which is now a recreational space, but it's sort of a botanical garden as well as there are plant names, some of them locked in sort of 1940s nomenclature. And I was embroidering water into these Sweetwater canals, and I was thinking I could probably dig the canals thus as I could embroider the water into it. And but yes, with something like the embroidery on the scale of a 10 by 12 foot Kashan, it does feel, it is very physical. It does feel that you're covering terrain and you're making a mark through that activity in a very physical sort of way, but much like walking, perhaps.
I think I just kind of think about the line for a walk, all place kind of notion, and it's quite interesting. I think you mentioned eloquent as well, so I think some of the kind of projects that I in terms of your journeys, in terms of cities and public spaces. Yeah. I think for me the processes, they were kind of entangled, different media in a way. So yeah, I just ultimately I think in a way it's definitely got me out of my shell in a way, in the previous work that I was doing. But in a way, it brought me challenges with not only with people, but revisiting a particular site, space, and the context of it within the kind of things that I mentioned earlier, interested me about architecture within British cities. And in a way, it's, some of it that was mentioned within the kind of historical context, yes, but how do you deal with this as artists? But if you've got the legacy of the British art and the European art tradition, history is so embedded in it. The landscape, for example, just been mentioned. So yeah, I mean, you know, one tries to kind of dig out a personal kind of journey.
Yeah, you equate the walking with lines and mark making, and that I would very much agree with that. That my walking feeds into drawings. Like the home project was very much about drawing and mark making, and in the end, I would sum it all up that I'm really interested in storytelling, and whether that's storytelling through walking or storytelling through the process of drawing. I'm not so much interested in the end result of a drawing. In the home project, actually the final drawings ended up somewhere. Some were given to me as a gift, others were people wanted to keep them. So it was very much about the process of drawing. And why was that interesting to me? Because it's storytelling in various ways. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah.
You were talking about affinity to a place. I just want to pick up on your talk, Said. When you put the slide up of Woking, I thought, oh, it's a coincidence, I'm from Woking. And then you put up the picture of Brookwood Cemetery, and I'm from Brookwood. Right. So I felt a very strong affinity suddenly to that, even to just keep quiet in my seat, actually. Yeah. And in my art training, I've been in the cemetery. I go there when I go home a lot. So it's a place that I've spent a lot of time in and kind of grown up in. And when I made work about the cemetery, I felt, well, I still do now actually, I feel quite guilty. I don't know about the whole history of the cemetery. I have a very potted history of what went on there. But it's a really beautiful place, and the regimented lines of headstones have a huge impact. And I always observe tourists or, well, Americans and families that come from all over the world to visit headstones. And there are, as far as I know, there's no actual remains in the cemetery. A lot of them are just headstones. But people will come from America just to see a headstone with a name of a family member on them. But my question maybe to all three of you is, when you're doing site-specific work, how much about that place do you feel you need to know before you're ready to make work? Do you think that someone can instantly make work in a new place just as observation? Or how does that change when you want to make more of a research project about it and put more into it before you start to make your own mark on that?
Fascinating and complex. Thank you very much for your contribution and questions. It's really interesting when you mention this American issue within the gravestones, that just in terms of its name or a record, that's actually, overall it's like a memorial in a way. And for me, the project kind of, maybe if not in early stages, definitely during the process of creating and researching, it's become actually a memorial. And I sometimes feel, although I've had ups and downs and really difficult times and really enjoyed it, the process, I don't think I kind of think that one can choose beforehand, not in my case anyway, that preconceived idea of how one chooses a particular project, and do you have an affinity to it or not. I definitely started liking it more and more. I found it very difficult to visit graveyards, but this Brookwood is a massive one, and even the other one, the Muslim burial ground, where there's no graves actually. But it had a certain resonance, a certain feeling, and that's what maybe as, I don't know, as artists or writers or poets or whatever, when individual people go jogging there, it kind of offers you something, or affects, it has some kind of effect on you. But I think ultimately, I feel that my project, that how do we memorialize a kind of a historical event, which is so major, which was kind of major for our kind of European context, but it became so global. And if you look at the conflicts that are around, how do we memorialize an issue in that context? And for me, in a small way, I think the exhibition or a particular part of work that travels or shares, I share it wherever, I think it's a kind of sense of a memorial. I don't know whether it answers your question, but this is a thing that perhaps I didn't really talk about, but it kind of just reminded me of your kind of point. And how do you relate to a place, a sense of affinity to a place and country? So you kind of, I tried to say that maybe through these things you can have affinity through capturing it as an artist. So,
yeah, you ask how much time or you need to spend with a place to make a work. I think, as I also said, my work is a response, walking in a space of response to a specific place, and with time the response just changes. So if, to give an example, works that I've shown are all responses to a place. Now the Victoria piece in Wakefield grew over the period of, well, let's say 15 years, and the response can be a response to a place after an hour, so it just changes the depth of the engagement. The home project was an absolute necessity for me. I lived in Pakistan for 4 years, and to understand that space, it was important for me to talk to people, to understand stories that have been passing. And working on that project, it took me 6 years before it actually became something that was shown. So it differs, of course, but I think each work is a response to a specific place.
As an artist, I'm somebody who tends to go back into places. So if it was a site-specific project that might have an outcome in one period, I might go back into it with more depth and at another time. And I think you can't know enough about a place for a site-specific project, but one of the ways of working with that is perhaps to collaborate. And that's something that I've done a lot in my life. And bring in other levels of awareness or expertise or local knowledge, and that can be a very exciting place to be, and that's my contribution to this answer.
On that collaborative note, perhaps that almost sounds the bell. I'll pass over to Sarah.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Hamad and to David, to Syed and to Sophie for such a really wonderful evening, and a way to, well, not round off. I don't think we've rounded off this series of conversations. I think we've started to open things up and perhaps not untangle, but to entangle further. And I want to thank you all for coming with us on this journey of this public lecture course, and really thinking through this idea with us across different places and across different periods and with different speakers. I think we've heard a really rich array of different approaches to thinking about the entangled histories between Britain and South Asia. So I hope these are conversations that we're going to continue together, and we'll have another opportunity to come back together and to continue our conversations. And so I want to thank you all collectively, and to Hamad as well for being such a fabulous collaborator, and it's been a real pleasure to think through these ideas with you and to shape these 5 weeks. So thank you very much, and thank you to Nermin. We'll give her another wave again on the live stream for keeping us all together and running things so brilliantly. So thank you very much to everyone, and let's thank our speakers again this evening.